Hey guys, it's Ohm, and this is an update to my Planetary Annihilation coverage. A game that I've been following since it went into a Kickstarter, and at that time it was really just an idea by Uber Entertainment. And they made a concept video. It wasn't actual gameplay, and they said, here's what we want to make. We want to make essentially a sequel to Total Annihilation, except instead of just taking place on a flat map, essentially, we want to have it be almost like a solar system based RTS game. So that involves of course, usually a sun at the center of the system, and usually one or more planets and even moons. Moons might even have their own rotation around the sun, or it might be around a planet. There might be multiple moons around a planet, just, really cool stuff like that. And I've got to say, I was super pumped about it. I, of course, covered the Kickstarter itself with a video, and then I followed up and also released an alpha video once I got access to the alpha via my pledge, and now the beta is out. So, there's good news and there's not so good news. I don't want to say bad news necessarily, because the game is pre-release. But compared to the alpha, the experience is definitely much more well-rounded, and it's more representative of what the developers have kind of talked about since the beginning. Is, essentially they wanted to have combat that could take place not just on one specific map or world, but across other worlds or moons or whatever else as well. And this beta build, actually has some of that plugged in. So let's go over some of the things. I did actually make some notes in relation to some of the things I was happy about, some of the things I wasn't so happy about, or even what potentially needs more work. And first off, the first thing I'm going to say is that they have made some serious progress towards the coolest concept of all, and again, that's warfare across different planets, moons, whatever else. The only thing you can't really get to at the moment is the sun. Although I would like to be able to lock your camera onto the sun so you could watch planets rotate around from that perspective. But aside from that, anything else besides the sun, you can lock your camera onto, and if you can get units there, you can build on it. That in itself is awesome. And let me just say, I have had some jaw-dropping moments. There was one scene in particular that just blew my mind. I was watching, after I died in a game, I was watching other players play, and one of them had gotten off the planet and he started to colonize, it was either a moon or like just a big asteroid of sorts that was stuck in orbit, which I guess you would probably call a moon anyway. But anyway, so as this player is building on this, this other moon or whatever else it was, I'm locked in on it and I'm watching him do his thing, and as I'm doing this, I see the core home planet that he came from and that all the other players were still on. And he is still, or as he's doing his thing, I could still see all the other players on the planet that's, off in the distance, essentially. And they're still doing stuff. They're still moving their units around. I could see the combat and whatever else. And I was fascinated by this, by what I was seeing, because in a lot of games, I would think that if they're going to try to replicate this experience, they're not going to take the time to draw everything else that's going on a planet that, even if there's something, if you're watching a moon and it's orbiting the planet, it was difficult for me to wrap my head around the fact that I was actually seeing everything that was going on the planet. It was amazing. It was one of the coolest moments in RTS I've had. Just that right there, just that scene. And I actually kind of went from being kind of iffy as to the value of the beta to almost immediately becoming, I started telling people, man, this kind of blew my mind. Like, listen to what happened here. And I know it's kind of simple, and it's easily, it's something that you could replicate just by playing the game, just for a little bit. But for me, just seeing that, it was pretty amazing. The other thing is that it's very clear at this point that the macro and micro aspects that fans loved in Total Annihilation, or even Supreme Commander, it's all still there. Or I don't want to say still there, because it's not like, the Supreme Commander guys are, the whole team is working on this or anything, but this is essentially the spiritual successor to these games. And One thing that was, that fans have always known, of course, about this series of games, or this genre of RTS, or subgenre rather of RTS, is that you have to worry about both microing your buildings, or not your building, I'm sorry, your builders, your constructors, and you have to get them all queued up to do their thing. But you also have to then manage your resources. You have, both energy and what is it? Is it like ore or minerals? I forget what they call it in this. But you've got to manage, the economic aspect. But microing, for the most part, comes down to microing your orbital lifters, your commander, your builders. Aside from that, everything else is kind of on a macro scale. This is a game that greatly rewards having multiple factories and whatnot pumping out units like there's no tomorrow. And if you could keep your economy up to speed, there's really no limit to how many units you can produce. I mean, you could have armies that are hundreds of units big. Easily. And I don't know if there's a hard-coded limit in there somewhere, but I've never seen it. And I have had armies literally of hundreds of units, especially bots. Bots are cheap and quick to make, and it is very impressive. And they have shown that they are on track to accomplish that. Now, it's not perfect. I'll get into that later. But that in itself is also something that I found very impressive, is that, again, the developers, they are definitely staying in line with what Total Annihilation and even Supreme Commander were all about. Despite there being this whole planetary aspect of things as well. One other thing that I also found really satisfying in the game was, I just talked about bots, but naval units. A lot of games, they don't do naval well. In this game, they've got, decent number of options for different ships you can make. And even on Tier 1, they've got some ground pounders that are really, really satisfying. You park them on a coast, or you have them patrol along a coast, and if they can see vision on stuff, they can usually hit it. Pretty far inland, too. They've got good range. That was quite impressive to me. Something I wasn't expecting. I was expecting there to be far more of a focus on land combat, or even air. Which there are many land combat options, but naval to me kind of felt the best. And I'm hoping that I do see some really good ocean-type world maps, or even, just a kind of like an Earth-like planet. And actually, I played on one recently that was Earth-like, and it was a lot of fun. Aside from that, multiplayer. Now, one thing I'm going to point out, and this is kind of covered in my, the not-so-good section, is multiplayer. When it works really well right now. And this can be with up to, at least the max I've seen, 8 players. 4 versus 4 or 8-player free-for-all. And when it works well. And so far, I'd say that my initial experience with the beta was pretty rocky, because it seemed like usually hosts were disappearing. But as long as the host sticks around, even if you crash in this game, the game allows you to reconnect. Which is something that normally you wouldn't expect out of a lot of RTS games, but this game has that support this early, which is great. Especially given the fact that the game's pre-release, and you're probably going to run into a problem from time to time with stability. Again, as long as that host is there, you can get back in. And, that's really badass, for a game like this, especially given that games can take a very long time. Aside from that, there's this functionality built into the game also that was kind of unexpected as well, in that there's a real-time recorder that's recording the gameplay as you play, and at any time you can actually rewind and watch what's happened in the match and then catch back up whenever you want. Now obviously, if you're in a really intense engagement or whatever else, probably the last thing you want to do is pull back and say, oh, let me go watch what happened while my units still fight. But that functionality is there, where you can literally go back and say, hey, what happened? How come my base just got wiped out? Oh, let me hit rewind a couple times, and you get to watch. Oh shit, he just nuked me or something. Which, really, really cool feature. And it can also help you kind of pinpoint, for example, if something did happen to your base, you can do some investigative work there, figure out what happened, and maybe even where it came from, which is really big. And also, at the end of the game, you can do the same thing. The game will let you go back and watch the whole game start to finish, speed it up, slow it down. It's a really cool system. And it's certainly innovative. I can't personally think of any other RTS game that's offered anything like this while you play. So it's really cool. Let's see, what else? I did note that Planetary Annihilation, without a doubt, has some serious potential to become one of the most innovative RTS games I've seen in a very, very long time. Now, I'm not going to say that, you know, there hasn't been innovation in RTS before. Warcraft 3, for example, I remember when the RPG elements were announced. There were actually a lot of fans out there that were really pissed. They're like, what the hell are you doing? Like, you're going to add heroes to an RTS game? You're going to have an inventory system? There's going to be leveling up? You know, there's going to be, you know, like different items that you can use on with your character and teleporting and whatnot. A lot of people were pissed off about it. And even with, for example, Company of Heroes 2, that recently came out. The snow and the blizzards and whatnot, there was some innovation there. And even games like Ruse or World in Conflict or War Game, Airland Battles, you know, there's been some innovation there with how reinforcements and whatnot happen, or how you get, or how you earn more money to spend and whatnot. But in terms of like overall innovation, I don't think, like, I really can't think of anything quite at this scale. Again, of like planetary combat. And even maybe, if you're lucky, turning something like a moon or an asteroid into a weapon and ramming it into a planet. That's just, it's amazing when you think about it. And if Uber Entertainment can polish this experience up, it very well could be one of the best RTS games of all time. Potentially. I don't want to declare it that right now, because it's, you know, still got a long way to go. But they are working, you know, towards some concepts that we've never seen before, and that have the potential to be a ton of fun. Another thing I noted was that I really do like the fact that I'm seeing things come together when it comes to the audio experience, or rather I should say hearing things come together. The sound effects are certainly more in there at this point in the beta compared to the alpha, and the music is there as well. Now the music, personally I see myself eventually turning it off, but it's got that Total Annihilation feel. I'm more of a fan of like electronic type soundtracks and whatnot, or even like Red Alert, which is kind of like a hybrid of like electronic slash like computer rock, like I don't, or metal even, I don't know how to explain it. But things are coming together with the audio experience. And there's some other things too that are worth noting. There's queued orders work really well. It's really nice to be able to tell your constructors, okay, I want you to build a, you know, an ore mine or whatever it's called. Here, go down the list, create a huge list of like build orders, and then walk away and go to your next unit and do something else with it. Or move your army out and know that the AI, for the most part, is going to take care of those orders. And also, it's really nice to get a lot of communication from the developers. They've been doing their video updates and whatnot, or their stream updates, and then they usually upload the VODs to YouTube. They're a very vocal bunch, and beyond that, they also release a lot of updates. So it feels like since the beta's been released, there's been at least 2 or 3 updates. So they definitely are showing themselves to be very committed to the game and getting new updates and builds out into the hands of the testers, which is great. Now, aside from all that, and I'm pretty sure I covered everything. If anything else comes to mind, I'll mention it. But there are some things that I'm not entirely happy about at this point. But then again, you know, keep in mind this is a pre-release product. It's not fully polished. Now, first off, the tech tree to me feels a little bit narrow, and when you get into the game, you'll understand if you haven't played it already. The land units, for example, you know, there's a standard vehicle factory, there's a bot factory. That's the extent of your tier 1 ground units. Now, there's no real variance though. Like, you've got, for example, bots. Bots are quick to make, and they do great damage in numbers, but they have limited range and they don't hit so hard. And then there's also like a tank type unit, and the tank hits harder, but it's slower, and it doesn't fire as fast. And, you know, then you've got your anti-air units. Well, guess what? There's an anti-air bot. there's an anti-air vehicle or tank vehicle as well, if I recall correctly. I don't have the tech tree in front of me, but this is going off memory. To me, it felt kind of a little bit thin. There's very little specialization. For example, even when you're working with air units, right? You've got at Tier 1, you've got an air unit that scouts. You've got an air unit that can attack other air. And you have an air unit that bombs. Now, I do want to touch on the bomber really quick while it's in my mind. The bomber itself feels kind of wonky, the way that it operates. It's hard to tell. If you tell it to target something, it seems like sometimes they don't drop their bombs. I really don't know what's going on. There's not that immediate response that you get with the land units when you tell them to attack something and they start shooting shells, and you see the shells hit, and then, next thing you know, the units either damaged or destroyed. Bombers, you don't really have that. But anyway, going back to the main point, you're not seeing a lot of specialization. It's not like you're seeing aircraft that can drop napalm or drop an EMP. You're not seeing like a tank that specializes. Like, for example, in Command & Conquer Generals, there was a flame tank, and you set it up and you tell it to do its special attack, which was an option, or you could do direct attack. But the special attack, it would sweep its nozzle left and right, and it would shoot out napalm waves, and it did crazy damage to structures. Pardon me, I'm losing my voice here. It would do crazy damage to structures, but not so much to units unless they were like infantry or something. You don't really see that kind of specialization. Even at higher tiers, the land units, yeah, you get an artillery unit and whatnot, and it gives you some extra range. You also get a heavy pounder tank. But again, not a whole lot in terms of specialization. And there's not really any upgrades that I've seen for units either. You can't make them hit harder. You can't make them shoot farther. You can't give them stuff like nuclear rounds or anything. And that's something that I do appreciate in RTS games, especially thinking back to some of the greats like Command & Conquer Generals and whatnot. Just having variation in the unit and having a need to specialize. And if you don't specialize, for example, or let's say you do specialize. You specialize in land units. But next thing you know, your opponent went air. Well, he kind of countered your build. At the moment, it feels like no matter what tech tree you go into, you can counter what the enemy is doing. So with that in mind, I do feel like the tech tree is a little bit thin. I'm hoping that they add more units. There were a ton of units added to Total Annihilation. The Cave Dog, I'm almost positive that's a developer. Yeah, it is. Okay. Cave Dog, they were at a point where they were releasing units for free. This is before the whole like DLC thing where you expected to pay for updates. They would release new units to their users, and it was really awesome. I'm hoping to see a lot of variety in this game, so you don't have these multi-purpose units that are like a jack of all trades in some situations, essentially. Aside from that, pathfinding is a little bit goofy at times, especially when you're moving around a lot of units. I'm sure it's quite a challenge for these guys. And I think with the way that they're trying to address pathfinding, they've also introduced some weird bugs. For example, I've had one situation where I was able to move ships over what appeared to be land. Now, when I zoomed in all the way, it looked like there was like a tiny sliver of water running over land, but there's no way heavy warships should have been going over that stuff. Also, I did notice some weird stuff with units that would continually dance around if I told them to move somewhere. Instead of forming a nice, neat formation, they would sometimes form circles and stare at each other, or they would cluster together and keep trying to walk into the center point. Some weird stuff like that. But nothing too big. That's something, obviously, that they can polish up pretty easily. Beyond that, the graphics in general, like I feel like the graphics in the game, at times it can look really good. But at times it looks like it could have been made easily 10 plus years ago. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of challenges when it comes to drawing so many units, drawing, planets and trees and little objects and whatnot. I don't even know if they're objects, but, just terrain, textures and whatnot, rocks or whatever else is supposed to be on the ground. And of course, like the moons and all that, I'm sure there's a lot of horsepower needed for that type of stuff. But, again, at the same time, it does at times appear kind of not the best, and it'll be interesting to see what they do with it. Is this something that they're are they going to be able to make a game that looks really fantastic, or are they going to have to compromise and keep things simple because of the grand scale of the game? I think a lot of players might prefer a simpler look just to have all this extra cool tech and options, you know, such as, again, flying off to a moon and turning it into a weapon. You know, but at the same time, I'd love to have that plus really fantastic graphics. So it'll be, you know, again, interesting to see how they deal with that. Also, graphically, the shadows at times seem kind of off. It is nice to see how, as a, you know, a planet or a moon rotates, it, you know, there's essentially like day-night cycles that you get to see happen on the surface of the world or the moon. But sometimes it looks kind of bad. And also, if you ever have like an eclipse type situation where an object passes between you and the sun, the shadow cast almost always looks bad, and it doesn't look like it should. You'll usually see like a weird sliver of light for some reason. I don't know why. But I don't, you know, maybe that there's an actual reason for it. I just don't know. To me, when I see it, I expect there to be kind of like a moon or a big round circle going over the surface and then passing. But it's currently not like that. Beyond graphics, there is a pretty noticeable performance hit, both locally and network-wise, once there's a lot of units and buildings and whatnot on the planet, or on the planets or the planets and moons. The longer the game goes, the more that there's a significant or noticeable performance hit going on. And that's on the local side. Beyond that, though, there's also a network hit that's pretty apparent as well. Where, for example, a lot of times when I notice that, you know, I'm moving around a lot of units and I go in for a combat encounter, sometimes the game will just outright skip attack animations. You'll see life bars depleting and stuff, and you'll see some attacks happening, but not all attacks at once. For example, if you have a huge army of bots, I've noticed it more than anything when I've got a horde, essentially, of units, and they're all attacking at the same time. I don't know exactly what's causing that, or if that's something they're going to fix, but personally, I would like to be able to see all my units firing and not just have these animations drop off. Let's see, what else? Working with units in orbit can be a significant chore. So eventually you'll get to a point where you're going to build this like orbital module of sorts. And this module will let you create like fighters in space, it'll let you create satellites, it'll let you create like a transporter launcher type thing where it goes up in orbit. You could have it grab one of your units like your commander, take it off into orbit, and then send it to another planet. Now, that in itself is amazing, and when it, you know, when you can get it to work, it's great. But more often than not, I find myself kind of struggling to actually accomplish that feat. It's like, okay, I got my transporter up in orbit, now where is it? Okay, there it is. Now I need to tell it to come back and pick up something. Now it needs to go back into orbit. Now it needs to go and travel off to another planet. The whole process in itself seems kind of weird. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it takes some getting used to for sure. But again, this is all new stuff that the developers are introducing that we haven't seen in RTS before. I'm sure they'll figure out a way to make it more seamless. Again, that's something that's probably going to be quite easy for them to polish up. Alright, what else? I wrote that it also takes time to get used to fighting on an actual planet where raids can come from any direction, and it's certainly something that I struggled with at the start. I actually had to turn on an option in settings where it would bind my camera to like the poles and wouldn't let me like do weird rotations of the camera where I could like go off on an angle and all of a sudden have the planet like upside down. I like to keep, you know, an orientation there for me where I always kind of know where north is and I always know where south is. So even when you have that on though, like with RTS typically, you're working with a flat map, and if you go to the far edge of the map, you can't really go any further. You know, all edges, it's not like they loop back around and you can go straight down to the bottom edge and appear at the top. You know, it's not like that at all. But in this game, it is. In this game, just because you're spawned near the North Pole, you know, doesn't mean that, like, attacks, they could come from any direction. Or if you're at the equator. Really, there is no pole in, you know, in this game. I mean, yeah, there's a rotation, but attacks can come from anywhere. You can't just protect your bottom, bottom side of your base, because that's where the enemy, that's the only way they can come in. They could come in from any direction, 360 degrees around where you are. So that in itself does take some getting used to. But again, it's cool, and it's something I certainly appreciate. It just, for new players, I think it's something that, is going to be kind of a shock on the strategy side. But, again, once you do get used to it, it's something that I think you will learn to appreciate over time. Especially if you turn on those poles. Make sure that, if you're having trouble with it, make sure you turn on, like, the pole orientation. I forget what the setting is, but it's out there. It's in the, I think it's like options gameplay or something like that. Another thing, planet ramming, it is in, as mentioned, but it's really oddly implemented right now. I haven't been able to do it myself, but I was in a game where somebody did it on my team, and they eradicated the enemy because the enemy never got off the home world. Whereas they did, and then ultimately I did, right before the planet rammed. Or the moon did, rather. Now, the way it works right now is you build, like, engines on an asteroid. And it looks like you need to have so many. Now, I don't know how it works beyond that, but one thing I did notice that was kind of weird is the moon, it really doesn't seem to matter so much where you place the engines, at least as far as I could tell. It's not like you have to face the engines towards a planet. The way that these guys did it when they ultimately accomplished it is they put the engines in a way where, or in a position where it would essentially like keep it going the same direction as a planet. Now, when they actually rammed though with the moon, it was kind of interesting because what happened was all of a sudden the moon warped away to a further distance, and then it kind of came in. I'm trying to remember the term for it, but it had the correct pathing to ultimately collide. It was going along with the planet and then curved inwards towards it and ultimately smacked it and destroyed everything. But it kind of seemed a little bit weird to me that it didn't seem like the engine placement was really something you had to think about. You didn't have to worry about trying to correct a path or anything. It's just like once you had the engines and you activated the ram, that's what happened. So it is kind of weird. Also, when the ram finally happens, the whole game, at least for me, like the performance crashed, essentially. Like it went down to like 0 FPS, and I couldn't see what happened really. I kind of had to use my imagination for the most part, and I just knew that everything was dead. Also, it was kind of weird because you would expect this like really epic like explosion or the planet shattering or something like that. But currently in its current implementation, it just kind of merges with the planet, and then at that point, that's when you hear the explosions, and essentially if your enemies did not get off that planet, the game ends because they're all gonna die. So it is a game ender. All right, what else? It is, I did point out that it is difficult to get off a planet because of the whole satellite system, but beyond that, it takes an investment to actually get to that point where you can take off. And if you take off, it's actually pretty difficult to manage two different worlds at the same time. It's almost like, yeah, in a lot of ways it would be nice if you could stockpile resources, and I guess maybe you could set yourself up where you could set up a base, set up a bunch of like metal storage and energy storage, and then take off. But usually, like, I think most players are going to struggle with maintaining a presence on more than one planet or moon at a time, because otherwise it's just too much work. It's too much. It takes too much effort to manage two different planets. You got to scroll all the way out, scroll back into another planet or moon, do stuff there, and not have an eye on the other planet. I think it's going to be a lot for most players to take in, but it is cool. And with that in mind, it would be nice. Like right now, it seems like the game doesn't necessarily make it easy to spawn on different planets, but I'm guessing eventually the norm is probably going to be that where players don't always start on the same planet. One player might start on one, another player might start on a moon or something, and who knows what else. It really, like, there's unlimited possibilities for what they could do with different spawning points and whatnot. Okay, another thing I did notice that was kind of odd was, I already pointed out the ships that crossing across land. I had some issues where Commander was going into water, You know, and as I said, even with movement, where the units would sometimes they'd split off into multiple paths. Sometimes they would dance around when they'd get to their point. And also the other thing that's kind of annoying is sometimes queued orders would cancel, but the game wouldn't really give me feedback as to why. This especially happens sometimes when you're trying to get a build queue going. When you're trying to do a build queue, especially with like minerals or ore or whatever it's called, some locations of ore, for whatever reason, it won't build. And this also happens with building placement too. Sometimes the game will whitelist it and put the ghost down for you as you queue things up, but then when a unit gets there, it won't build it. Beyond that, it's also kind of annoying sometimes when you go and you queue up a bunch of structures, but your unit that's doing the building, which sometimes happens to be the commander, is dumb and doesn't take himself out of a position where he would be essentially boxed in by what he was building. So I'm hoping that they address that as well. It's always frustrating when you notice that your commander got stuck in the middle of a bunch of energy plants and you have to go and break one down in order to get out. And then there is some issues with instability, and you know, as I mentioned, there is the option to drop back in, assuming that the host is still around. But one thing that's really frustrating for me is at least half of my games have ended because it seems like the host disappeared. And at that point, there's no reconnecting to it. So, you know, it is a little bit frustrating. But, you know, again, you know, it's tough to bust their chops too much on that. You know, I was tempted to kind of point out that the alpha was much more stable, but at the same time, in beta, they've introduced all this new stuff. So, you know, and given the fact that it's the first week of beta, it is really hard to get on our case about it. And last but not least, this was the last issue I kind of had fresh in my mind here, is that the icons right now, when you scroll out, they're kind of hard to read, in my opinion, and there's not really much color variety. It would be nice to be able to toggle options where air units might show up as a certain color, ground units are a different one, you know, for example, ground units being brown, air units being blue, or, you know, something like that, and where enemy units are always red. But right now it is kind of difficult to tell, and also it's hard to tell even when an opponent is attacking you at times, because, for example, a recent game I had, the color of my units when I scrolled out, they were kind of like a dark gray. The enemy was black. So when there'd be a mix of all those units, it would get confusing for me, where I was like, all right, what, you know, which unit is which? Or, you know, I'd look over at another side of the world when I was playing a team game. I'm like, wait, are those allied units or are those enemy units? I feel that they should work on the color coding a bit, and also just the icons themselves, so you can kind of, you know, pick out what's what visually quickly. You know, for example, they've got a little radar icon. The radar one now, it's not the best, but you can tell based off what it is just by looking at the icon. The other stuff, you can't really tell so easy. And I'm hoping that they address that. Aside from that, though, you know, again, this game has a ton of potential. And, you know, the pricing thing I don't want to get into again. I already got into that with my previous video with the alpha pricing. I totally agree with Uber's stance on keeping the pricing what it was in the Kickstarter, because really that's only fair to Kickstarters. But you know, is it worth $60? That's really ultimately your call. Personally, if I was just a regular gamer who wasn't ever trying to criticize or evaluate new releases, personally I would want to wait till retail, just because I'd want to see the most polished experience. You know, getting all this playtime in with a beta when a lot of things aren't quite plugged in yet or polished, it's going to certainly take away from some of the appeal that retail is going to bring. You know, where it's like, oh wow, you know, this is so cool, awesome explosions, and like pathfinding is great potentially, or whatever else. Right now I get to see some of the bad, you know, just like with the alpha build. When you see a lot of the bad, you know, it takes a little bit away from the end product, you know, that wow factor and whatnot. So it's really your call, but right now I am excited about what I'm seeing, and this is a game that I'm keeping a lot of faith in, you know, at least when it comes to what the developers can accomplish here, because they are delivering, you know, in a fairly decent way, exactly what they said that they were going to do. It's not polished, but the groundwork is there, and you can play around with it. So, yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes, guys. There's definitely going to be more videos on Planetary Annihilation, especially as the beta progresses and we get near retail. But let me know what you guys thought in the comments. I really like to hear your feedback. And yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see all of you next time.